Hello, today I'm going to be painting this painting and trying to explain my process and my thoughts as I paint. I've been asked a few times lately if I could do a video in real time and not speed it up. So this is going to be a long video. This painting took me about an hour and I've cut out little bits where I was not doing anything or just left the room, etc. So it's going to be a long one. Hopefully it's going to be interesting. I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. So now let's get on to explaining what I'm doing. I started the back of the painting, so I have the sky in already and some sort of cliffs, and I'm blocking in the trees. What I'm doing is trying to, so I've got the reference up on a screen in front of me. I don't want to put it on my iPad because the iPad's not very big, so it takes up too much space. So I've got a big monitor in front of me. So what I try to do is block in the big shapes. Most paintings will have, landscape paintings will have 5 or 6 big shapes. And I try and recognize those, and I'm looking for the darkest color in the big shape. And I don't try and match the shape of the reference really at all. I'm just guessing, and I don't want to really copy the reference anyway. It just gives me something to start with, gives me a good idea. So I'll get all those big shapes in first, and that is a very important stage. You have to get these shapes looking right because it's very difficult to change them once they're in. Obviously you can go back, but once you have the shapes in, when you change your shape, it sometimes affects all the other shapes. So you really want to get this right because this is really what the painting is going to look like. If you zoom out and ignore the details, this is basically going to be the painting. So if you don't like anything at this stage, you really want to sort that out. So you see I take my time with these shapes, and I'm usually much faster when I'm doing the next stage where the details, etc. So right now I'm pretty slow and I make sure I get this right. Now, how do you get it right is really kind of up to you what you want it to look like, and there are some rules, but I won't get into those because they're a little bit complicated now. So they'll probably be a video by themselves. But if you're copying the reference anyway and you're not too experienced, then just follow the reference, more accurately. You get to go off reference when you've done this 1,000 times, like I have. So I don't really care about the reference. It's just a guide. But very useful. I mean, without the reference, it'd be quite hard to get the colors. And you can see sometimes when I'm picking colors, I am quite careful of the color. I mean, we can change it later on, so it's not a big deal. But one thing you do want to get right is, if you can anyway, and I get it wrong too, lots of times, is to get the lightness correct. So how dark or light the color is. Because that's quite tricky to change later. Once you've put the details on, not impossible, but tricky. And I know because I'm talking over this painting after I've done it, that grey in the background, the grey blue cliffs, is actually wrong and it's too light. So you'll do that often, make mistakes. One teacher I had who is a great painter always said it's, the level of skill is when you can see all the problems and fix them. Early on, you won't see the problems, and you'll get to the end and you'll wonder, why does it look odd? You can kind of tell something's off, but you don't really know what it is. So with experience, you'll be able to see the problems earlier on and fix them. And it's really about fixing them all the time, seeing the problems and being able to fix them. And, I've been painting landscapes for like 10 years now or something. And 10 years ago, I could see the problems, but I couldn't fix them. I didn't really know what the problem was. And over time, you'll learn tricks of what's wrong and what you can do about it. I can't really tell you rules about that. There's just being able to see something's off. And there's really only a few things you can do when something's off anyway. like change the color. Here we go. I noticed the cliff is too light, so using the tool menu in Procreate, you can change all sorts of things. Just have a play around with them. They're not, overly difficult. They're fairly simple with sliders and things, so just play around and see what you can do with them. So now once I'm happy with the block in, make sure all the block end's finished. So you've got all the big shapes in and the canvas is covered. The sky might not look covered, but it's a bright day, so there isn't really much of a sky. And it's kind of blown out, which is kind of a good look because we do that a lot in our real photos on our phones and things. By the way, that little controller in my hand is hooked up via Bluetooth, so I can swap between the selection tool and commit the changes. So every time I tap the little button, the selection tool will come on. If I tap it again, it will go off. It just makes things a lot quicker than tapping the little blue icons up the top. I really only have the selection tool and undo on that little controller. There's got lots of buttons, but if you put too many buttons, you don't remember which one's which. So only I have 2 buttons, but it does speed me up a lot. Totally not necessary, of course. Sometimes I don't use it. I use it more when I'm doing complicated ones where I know I'll be using the select tool a lot. So back to the painting. I'm onto the details phase now, where basically in this style I try to only have maybe 2 or 3 colors into the detail. Sometimes just 1, so that means the dark and a light. And I put more effort into where I want the focus to be. So one major mistake I used to make all the time is I used to put detail absolutely everywhere. And the problem with that is the viewer doesn't really know where to focus on. So you want to put all your detail where you want the focus to be, which is kind of like off-center to the right is the water and the bright orangey bush and things like that. So it doesn't have to be a specific thing. It can just be an area. My point being is the cliff thing on the right, the big, on the left, sorry, the big chunky rock thing. You'll notice that I don't, you can see the finished painting up the top there. I don't put much detail on that because I don't want you looking at it. So if you have too many details on that and too many bright highlights, etc., you'll look at it. And the point is you're supposed to have areas of detail and areas of not detail. So just decide where you want somewhere to look and be careful about adding detail anywhere else. And you can't really overdo that because if you don't put detail somewhere else, it doesn't really matter. Your brain will automatically fill that in as a viewer anyway. So if you're unsure, then do less, not more. Mostly as a beginner, you'll probably want to do more detail because you think you're going to make it better, but it's actually the other way around. If you try and keep it simple, you got a much easier chance of making it work. That said, this is a fairly complicated painting because it's got many layers to it. So we've got the sky, we've got the cliff, we got the yellow bush, we got the blue bush, then we got the ground, and then the waterfall. Then we got some rocks and a big rock, and then more stuff in the foreground. So I wouldn't say this is an easy painting. And if I struggle to recognize the shapes, the big shapes early on, which I did, then I can tell this is going to be a tricky one. So when I'm talking about detail and I say, I put 1 or 2 colors mostly, water's a little bit different. You need a lot more layers to make it look more convincing. Even though this is stylized, you still need to build up to white. It shouldn't be, you can go white, but try to avoid going too white. But to make it look realistic, water has obviously translucency to it, so you need to add a few more layers. So one trick to get soft things is to do it on a new layer. Make your big shape and then use Gaussian blur and it'll make it nice and soft. The trick is you'll have to do this a few times though, so you'll see me doing it again now. I think I did it on the wrong layer actually, so you might see me undo this, but yeah, so I'm doing it again over the top. and then you'll have to Gaussian blur. When you Gaussian blur it, it kind of spreads out, so make sure you make it a bit bigger than what you need. And so you see I got a few layers to do the mist, and now I'm joining them together. You can pinch the layers together. I try to keep layers fairly simple because I need to manipulate them sometimes, and I don't want to change the colors of 3 different layers. It's quite annoying. You can't do that in other photo apps, drawing apps. You can usually put an adjustment layer above multiple layers, and then you can change all 3 at the same time, which is handy. I don't know why Procreate doesn't do that. Procreate has a bunch of weird things missing, to be honest. Like it doesn't have gradients or anything. So, well, not unless it's something I've been missing. So you have to do little tricks, but you can always find a way. They're quite strange with their choices, but they're getting slow with releasing interesting new stuff. So, but it's still a great app, and it's the one I use the most. There's a couple other ones, but I generally always go back to Procreate because it's nice and well, it's not simple, but relatively simple. So now we're on to doing the contrasty things. You might say that, why didn't I block in this tree early on? Because it's, it's a big shape, it's a big block. Why didn't I do that? Even though it's quite big, it's still detail and it's got lots of holes in it. And to be honest, it's optional. So you might not end up putting it in. So, you can do, bits like that. It's still detail, even though it's quite big. You could have done it at the start, to be honest, but I didn't even know if I wanted it, so I left it to the end. You'll notice when I pick the colors, even on the tree, I just approximate what color I want, and then I'll change it when it's all in. It's much easier to change the big color when you can see it in action. When you're choosing a color on the color palette, I really have very little idea if it's going to be the right color, because in isolation, colors kind of look weird, and until they're relatable to another color, you don't really know if it's going to work. So don't, spend ages choosing the color, because you're going to probably change it anyway. So now I'm on to detailing in these trees. Now, one thing to make sure with these trees is you don't really have any straight lines, because that wouldn't happen. So when I'm using the select tool, quite often I'll get straight lines, not on purpose, just because the tool does straight lines basically. So here I'm doing the same again. I'm trying to make sure that I don't have any straight lines, and it's interesting at the edges. I will have a few straight lines. I mean, it doesn't matter if you have a couple, but I mean, just get rid of big flat straights. And I'm using a brush here because the little bits are really small. I think it's called the Technical Studio pen, but it doesn't really matter. Use any pen, pencil. It doesn't really matter at all. So now I'm on to the highlights. Now, you got to be careful with these highlights because you have to make sure they come from where the sun's coming from. Now, you don't really have a strong sun in this. Well, sort of, but because it's a cloudy day, you can't tell where it's coming from. So it's coming from just a big white space in the middle. So because we got so many big trees and things, it's only coming through the middle. So where that white comes through, it'll make like a, towards the camera type thing, and hit the viewer, if that makes sense. So it's basically the sun is hitting a circle in the middle. So you need it to fade off as we go to the edges. Now making up light is very difficult, so the reference is helping me a lot there. Where the sun hits the landscape can really make or break a painting, and it elevates it to look a bit more skilled if the light hits the correct places, and you have shadows in the correct places. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect. You just have to notice that when you look at the landscape, you can tell where the sun's coming from. If it's confused, it just doesn't look so good. And so be careful where the sun's coming from and try to keep it consistent. Consistency is the key. It is not so much about how do I make it look, good. It's more just make sure the light is in, making sense. So I'm bouncing around the painting now, trying to put detail into each of the areas. Now, you don't really want a big, as much as I said, be careful with detail in the wrong places. You don't want any big space that doesn't have any detail, but it needs to be subtle detail. In real life, it's very rare that you'll have a space that doesn't have detail inside it, even if it's very subtle, unless something's really pitch black. But obviously, that doesn't really happen very often. So if you look at like a really dark tree or something, you'll still see lots of detail on it. So make sure you don't have a big space with nothing in it. Now they can be fairly big, but I mean just have a little bit of detail. Like this cliff face I'm doing now is have little amounts of detail. Now if you looked at the reference and you really had a look at this cliff, there's a lot of detail in the reference and lots of different shades of the cliff and rocks and little cracks and things like that. But we don't really need to do all that stuff. I mean, if you want to go realistic, then you would have to do it. But I'm not really too fond of realistic paintings. Well, I mean, they look great, but you might as well just use the reference if you're going to try and copy it exactly. It's not really going to add to it. So I like just to simplify things and make it more stylized and make it more mine. And you have to choose where you want to spend all your time. Like I said earlier, this painting, took me about an hour. I got it down to 37 minutes because sometimes I'm just sitting there thinking. But overall, it took about an hour. Now, if I wanted to really make this realistic and stuff, I'm still reasonably quick because I've done this many times, but we would be talking 3-4 hours, and I'd be using all sorts of, brushes and things to get the detail. Well, I don't really use many brushes when I use brushes, but it just gets more complicated, and I don't think it looks much better, to be honest. I mean, if you like realistic paintings, I'm not saying don't do it, but it's something I used to do, but the more I paint now, the more stylized I want it to be, and make it look like something I did rather than copying the reference. If two people copy the reference, depending on skill level, they're going to look roughly the same. So I don't really see much point in that. But if you enjoy it, do it. I used to. So you could still use this method to get you close to your realism if you wanted to, because you still need the basics underneath, and then the realism comes on top. So this style will still work. You'll just have to spend another couple of hours, really analyzing the painting and seeing the color shifts and things like that. So realism, you wouldn't use as saturated colors as I have. Everything in real life is kind of gray. So you just desaturate all the colors, and you'd have a lot more color shifts. So if you look at a tree, anything not man-made is a bit different, but naturally you'll see grass and it'll have a lot of different colors in it. It'll be orange, browns, greens, grays, pretty much everything, just all desaturated. And that can look good, and maybe I'll introduce more variations into my paintings while you're keeping it simple. You'll see in a bit, like the bottom orangey red tree, that I do this, and I'll explain that when I get to it. I can't remember when I get to it, but you'll see in the finished painting up the top that it's orangey up the top and red down the bottom. Now that shifting color can add a lot to things. I don't do it everywhere because again, you go overboard. If you find something you like and it works, we have a tendency to do it everywhere, where that's not really the key to making good landscapes. The key is to use things sparingly. So if you get a like the nice orangey red tree down the bottom, you might think, oh, that's great, and you'll put several of them. But it only looks good because it's one of them, and there's a little bit of it in the top trees. But if you go overboard, it won't look good anymore. So you really have to pay attention not to repeat your patterns. And early on when I started landscapes, I would do that all the time. So you'll notice, if you haven't done this very often, when you make a nice shape, your brain will remember that shape because you just did it, and it'll remember that it worked. And so it will try to repeat that pattern even if you don't even try. So try and make a shape of a tree and then do another tree next to it. And if you're not careful, and I still do this, it will make your brain subconsciously will make the exact same shape right next to it. And you have to learn to not do that. It is simply just repetition of remember not to make the same shape, and you have to slow down. And even if you do, it's okay. Just make sure you change that shape. Earlier I was talking about problems and solving them. And one thing to recognize is when you make the same shape twice. And you'll see me doing it here because it's not really possible to stop yourself every time. And one of the reasons I like to paint fast is because you're less likely to make the same shapes constantly. But I still do. It's sometimes I'll slow down as I'm making the shape, and I'll recognize, oh, I just did the exact same shape. And you probably see me do it here. I think I just did it then. I've just done about 4 shapes in the tree, which are all almost exactly the same. Now, usually I'll go back to those and recognize, oh, I got 4 shapes exactly the same there, and I'll go change them. Here we're adding different shades of colors to that tree. Now, so I did the trick with the Gaussian blur again. So create a new layer, make a shape, make sure clipper mask is on so it conforms to the shape underneath. And then you can Gaussian blur it, and that will make it smooth. And then merge the shapes back together. So I'm back working on the mist and joining it into the water. When you have mist, make sure it kind of blends in with the background. Again, I'm doing the Gaussian blur trick. You could just use a soft brush, probably. Well, not probably, definitely you could. But I find this method really quick and it gets really smooth, which is nice. So you'll see me do it now. Right, so that's really smooth. That's quite tricky to do the brush because it kind of goes all over the place. So, and you probably have to select and mess around anyway. So, plus you get nice shapes with the Gaussian blur because you don't exactly know what you're going to get. So it works quite well. So back to the detailing again. You could spend a long time doing this. I try to keep a reasonable amount of time, but it's a tree and it's a big bushy tree and they do have a lot of detail. You can't really simplify this too much because it just won't look like a tree. So you can see when I get to this stage of the painting, I kind of pause a lot because I'm wondering what to do next. So I'm not really looking at the reference too much now. I'm just trying to make my painting. It's just about light and shadow, and can I make anything look more interesting? Here I'm lightening the backs of the tree because the sun would be shining on them. I think looking back, I probably could have done this more because those little leaves and stuff in the back could have been blown out more by the sun coming through that gap, I think. So I missed something there. One thing to mention, you'll notice when you do trees and leaves, make sure you have some that are not part of the tree. So you'll see there's big gaps between the little leaves. It just makes it look like there's branches and the trees are coming off the branches. And you don't actually have to paint the branches like I have, missed them out. But it just looks like they would be there. But when your brain will just fill those in. So don't try and draw all those little twigs. It would look kind of messy anyway, so you really don't want to do that unless you want to go realistic. But because this is highly stylized, you you got to kind of pick where you want the details to be, otherwise it doesn't work. And it's a battle to keep this kind of as simple as possible but looking good. No, it's kind of up to you if you think I've managed it. I'm doing the Gaussian blur trick again. One thing to add atmosphere, you'll hear some artists talk about atmosphere quite a lot. That's things like mist and fog and clouds and things like that. Basically, soft things to merge other major parts to the background and things like that. So, atmosphere is a nice trick to make things look more together and more depth. So again, I still got to keep on adding more and more detail. So again, you can't really have a big blob of a tree, a bush like this one I'm working on, just totally black, because like I said, in real life that doesn't happen. So it would still have a lot of detail. Now again, I don't want to add too much detail because this is a simplified painting, but I still need a little bit of detail so you can see what it is and where the light would be hitting it. So I've put some highlights where it would hit the light would hit the little bush, and I'm doing the same down to the rock. Now earlier I mentioned that this rock shouldn't have much detail, but you can see the light would kind of come through the trees and hit a little bit. Now this stuff, these little highlights add a lot to the painting, because it kind of informs you where the sun is coming through and where it's hitting things, and that really adds quite a lot of realism to something that's not really real. But if you zoom out, this painting can look real. I mean, it is high contrast and things, so it doesn't really look real, but you get what I'm saying. So I did the same on the rock back there. I put detail in, but I made sure that it was dark, so it didn't really stand out. I'm adding some overlap detail. Nothing too fancy, just some twigs. I didn't like the shape, so I try again. Sometimes it takes me a few goes to do twigs and things. Otherwise, they can be funny shapes. Now, why I'm doing that is because, one, it adds depth, and two, our eyes really like contrast. So if I see something really bright, I want to put something dark in front of it. Now, this isn't in the reference painting, so I can kind of do whatever I want. But what I'll do is it'll make it seem like there's more depth to the painting, because you can see like this harsh little twiggy thing, and then you can see the water behind it. So it just tricks our eyes into giving us like that. You can tell now that water is like 20 feet away, just by doing these little twigs. So look for high contrast areas where you can add. I mean, it's not always going to be black and white, but it's going to be light and dark. Just like the stone up on the ridge in the middle. Although that's a bad shape, and I go and fix that later. But you can see I'm adding the highlights to the big red bits. I shouldn't mention I don't really have any order that I do anything in, other than the simple process of blocking in the big shape and then highlighting the shape where the sun is coming from, and adding detail to the shape. So I kind of bounce around trying to raise the quality of the entire painting bit by bit. If I haven't worked on an area for a while and it's not looking consistent to another part of the painting, I'll go back and do that. So what I'm trying to do is kind of get to a complete painting consistently over time. Otherwise, if you work on an area for too long, it can actually almost be too good. And then when it's too good, you have to raise the entire painting everywhere, or if the consistency is off, it looks strange. So once you have worked on an area for a little bit too long, then make sure you move to another one. and then move to another one again and again, and make sure you don't stick in one corner for a long time. I mean, I do know other painters though that complete an area, then move to another and complete the area, and so on. So it does actually work, but it just means that whatever the best area is, you kind of have to meet that standard. Now, that can be quite tricky because depending on your skill level and experience, you might not be good at doing trees or might not be good at doing water or something like that. So if you try and finish one area and you're really good at that area, and then you go to a different area and you don't have the skill to match the other area, it can kind of look weird. So bounce around the painting and move the consistency and the quality level up, and don't make it too good, if that makes any sense. And just consistency is more important than how good a part looks. I used to do this all the time. Is like I'm pretty good at rocks, pretty good at trees, not very good at clouds. So there's loads of things that I'm not very good at, and I try to avoid making it not as consistent. So I have to almost bring the other areas down to not stand out, if that makes sense. So you'll probably have things that you struggle with. I mean, water's a tricky one. Most people struggle with water because obviously it's flowing, and how do you make it look like water? It's kind of tricky. I didn't really go into detail what I do with water. It's actually simpler than it seems, but it just takes practice, and it's if you try and copy water from photos, it's very difficult because water in photos looks odd. There's lots of detail in it, and most of the time, and depending on where you live, I live in the UK, and most of the time our water is basically black. So it's almost impossible to copy water from my photos. And obviously water doesn't really look like anything like this, but you can tell it's water. It'd be very rare that you'd have a forest with water this color. Obviously it wouldn't. It'd probably be black. But that's why I don't really like copying photos, because photos look fairly boring to me. So I want to make it stylized and make it look fun. You can still tell it's water. The fact it's that color, it wouldn't be. But that doesn't matter. I'm trying to have fun with these paintings. I'm trying to make them look fun and think, oh, that'd be cool if it was actually like that. But as long as it represents what it is, I don't think it matters. So a tip for water anyway is copy other paintings of people who've painted water, because they have practiced it many times and they just make water how they in their style, and it won't really be much like copying photos, because copying water from photos is very difficult. Sometimes you can get those really nice photos in really sunny places where they kind of do look like this. So they're not too bad, but again, copying water is really, really difficult. So I basically don't copy it. I don't even copy the reference of what I'm looking at. I just have a simple process of doing very dark blue, then slightly lighter blue, in the right places. And you got to make sure when it's flat, you have to make sure that the highlights are horizontal, perfectly horizontal. If they're not, it'll look strange, because it'll look like the water's tilting, which can't happen. So, well, not unless it's flowing downhill or whatever. So, if it's flat, it needs to be just the highlights need to be very horizontal, and that's kind of a trick. But I can probably talk about water some more, because a lake is different, a stream is different, fast flowing river is difficult, the sea is completely different, and you got to look at the reference, and you got to think, oh, what's the important part of this, and then try and represent it. So most of the time, I'm really just trying to represent things. I'm not trying to copy them. So that's what it means by most of the time, to represent something, is to get the shape right. And the shape will mostly determine if you can tell what it is. So if you get the shape wrong, you're going to struggle for it to look like what it's supposed to look like. So trees, these big bushy trees have an obvious shape. The tree trunks have an obvious shape. Rocks weirdly have obvious shapes. They're always kind of square-ish and rounded from where they've been weathered. So that's what we think of rocks. So they're always, kind of square, sometimes circular, but they're all actually roughly the same. If you go too far off that, especially when I don't add much detail, it won't look like a rock. So you got to be a bit careful with your shapes. So this quite why I like using the select tool is because it's all about shape. That is literally all it's for, is to make shapes. So I find that the most fun part of the painting is to get shapes. So I didn't realize, but I'm done. So hopefully I've explained something of use in this very long video. And apologies if it's too long. I guess you can speed me up on YouTube. But if you liked it, give me a sub and a like, and let me know if you wanted more of these in real time or you want them quicker. Thanks for watching.